Hello and welcome to the channel. It's your favourite Scotsman here again, and we have a cracker of a video for you today. We are going to cover what you need to do in order to get $100,000 of income a year in retirement, regardless of what age you are now. Are you in? Alright, let's go. So step 1. The first thing you need to do is look at how many years you are away from retirement and figure out what $100,000 in today's money looks like then. This calculation is referred to as the future value equation, and although it can be complicated, I'm going to walk you through the steps. Inflation has been a hot topic over the past year, so you don't need me to tell you that the cost of everything rises over time. If you walk into the grocery store with $100 to spend today, and then walk into that same grocery store with $100 to spend 10 years from now, then you're going to walk out with less food in your hand in 10 years than you would now due to the cost of living increasing. So how exactly do you calculate that number? Well, first you'll need an annualized inflation percentage. For the sake of simple numbers, let's assume that 2% is the annual increase in price. While groceries are important, it's unlikely that a week of shockingly expensive romaine lettuce will ruin your chances at retirement, so let's bump that $100 up a touch. To calculate the future value of $100,000, you are going to multiply it by 1.02 for however many years you are away from retirement to account for compounding inflation. For example, if you want to know what $100,000 will be worth in 10 years, you need to take out your calculator and multiply it by 1.22, which we get to by doing this calculation. This gives you $121,899.44. So, in 10 years, $100,000 in today's dollars will be worth $122,000. In simpler terms, think of the calculation like this. The number 1 represents the starting value, the number 0.02 represents the annual inflation rate, which in this case is 2%, and the exponent 10 represents the number of years you want to calculate compounding inflation for. Alternatively, you could just sack off the whole calculator thing and use the inflation calculator link in the notes, which is much easier and takes about 3 seconds of your time. So now that we know what 100,000 looks like when you're going to retire, after we've factored in inflation, the second area we need to look at is how much other income you're going to have in retirement. This would include government pensions like CPP, OAS, a workplace pension if you have one, or perhaps income from a rental property. One point to note is that the dollar amount you receive from the government pensions increases each year to keep up with the cost of living, effectively making them indexed for inflation. Some workplace pensions will also have annual increases each year for inflation, but a number, especially those in the private sector, do not. It's important to know how your pension policy works and whether or not you have to account for the increases or lack thereof. Figuring out what your pension will be worth in today's dollars at retirement is very similar to the calculation we did above, except that instead of adding the annual inflation rate, you subtract it. Once all that is figured out and you add up your other sources of income, you subtract that number from $100,000 and you're left with the total dollar amount you need each year from your investments to shore up your finances. Let's say, as an example, that your workplace pension is $10,000 a year. Sticking with a 2% inflation rate, you will need to replace that lost purchasing power with the following amount of income. This means that you will need an additional $204 of income each year to maintain your purchasing power at the same level as before. Now, before we go any further, you should not be making any decisions based on this. I feel it's prudent to offer some words of caution at this point. The next part of the calculation is where things get a little tricky, and all biases aside, I would strongly recommend that whether this is me or somebody else, you work with a wealth advisor to go through this process. Alright, here comes the sale pitch. No, seriously. What I'm giving you here is a very, very short version of how to figure this out. We are not including any tax strategies along the way that may help you reach your goal faster if that's the case. This is where a full financial plan can be extremely important. Everyone's situation is as unique as they are, so a plan designed by a professional that factors in your values, goals, needs and circumstances will alleviate any stresses that you may have. Okay, so serious part out of the way. Let's move on to step 3. Now, I am providing you with a financial calculator which is included in the show notes. This will give you the tools to do a basic financial calculation. You're going to need to have a few things on hand. Your total portfolio size, your current annual savings, the number of years to retirement, an assumption on how long you will live for, an assumed inflation rate at retirement, and an assumed annual portfolio return. For your annual portfolio return, unless you're invested very aggressively, which brings about its own set of risks that we're not going to get into today, anywhere from 4 to 6%, depending on your appetite for risk, is not unreasonable. Personally, I always prefer to err on the side of caution with this, and I really wouldn't recommend going any higher than 5%. In terms of how long you will live for, again, I always prefer to be cautious, and that's why we always go with a standard age of 95 in all our plans. You know yourself and your family history better than anyone know. Once you've plugged all that in, you should have a ballpark number of how much you need to retire with $100,000 in Canada. So let's assume you're 65 and you're retiring today and you have combined $40,000 a year in government pensions between you and your spouse. This would leave you needing to raise $60,000 to account for the difference. If we assume 2% inflation, a 5% investment return and a life expectancy of 95, you will need to have around $1,370,000 in investment assets. If you have a workplace pension that is not indexed to inflation, you may also have to do a separate calculation to figure out how much you will need over and above to replace the lost purchasing power. Of course, as we've discussed, this is a pre-tax number and there's a whole host of things that can get you to the number you need quicker. From simply paying less in fees each year to making sure your portfolio is optimally allocated from an overall risk standpoint to various tax strategies that can be implemented depending on your situation. This video is doing what I set out for it to be doing, but don't be disheartened if you're a ways off. I'm a firm believer that everyone's number is different and it all boils down to cash flow and how much you need on a monthly basis. There are a number of lifestyle factors that impact that. Vacationing in Paris is probably more expensive than playing Monopoly with your grandkids, but both are just as fulfilling. So, thanks for joining us today. As always, any comments you have can be dropped in the section below. If you enjoyed today's video, do give us a thumbs up. And if you're interested in hearing more from us, go on and subscribe to the channel. It only takes a second or two. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.